Well, welcome. And this session of Teacher Tips is going to focus purely on what I entitle lesson bookends. So it's the starts and the finishes to our lessons. And arguably, I think we probably spend more time thinking about the start to our lessons than perhaps we do how lessons naturally come to an end. But taking our entry routines, our strong starts into consideration first, what I want to spend a few minutes doing is just sharing with you a few considerations and a few ideas that might make a difference to how your lessons begin. And if you're a primary phase teacher, you might wish to start this type of approach at the start of the day or after a natural break, so playtime or lunchtime in terms of the school day. And if you're a secondary teacher, you've got that constant conveyor belt from lesson to lesson to lesson of a different group of pupils coming your way. But first and foremost, when you're that first lesson of the day, or your first lesson begins, or any lesson begins, where are you in the context of your room? Are you sat in the room waiting for the pupils? Are you stood somewhere? Are you at the door? Are you outside waiting to welcome pupils? Where do you base yourself? Where do you position yourself? And I would argue a really powerful approach is to stand with 1 foot in and 1 foot out of your classroom door. So you can survey the outside of your classroom, and it might be that there's a corridor and you're trying to help support a school's one-way system, as one example. But equally, you're there to be that first face that the children, the pupils see as they come to your room. But equally, you've got that vantage point of being 1 foot in and 1 foot out, being able to survey your classroom as well. If you're stood at the classroom door, not only are you in a position where you can welcome children to your classrooms, but also you're reminding everybody that they are entering your classroom. So your expectations, your standards, your rules, your routines kind of reign supreme here, so to speak. And as the pupils come in, I think it's really, really important that we give a warm welcome, a warm, friendly welcome to the children. We positively frame the lesson, and we positively frame the children as they're coming into our class. So phrases like, you have a great lesson today, Mr. Smith. And I always think surnames is a really powerful way of addressing pupils. You had a brilliant lesson yesterday, Miss Jones. You're going to have an even better one today. Last lesson, Mr. Strickland, you were absolutely electric. It's going to be a great lesson today. And you're trying to, in many regards, big the children up as they're coming into your classroom setting. And I think this is really, really important, because if there were issues in the previous lesson, then you're wiping the slate clean, you're starting again. But actually, you're framing today. You're framing the session for today that it is going to be positive, it's going to be purposeful, and the expectations are high, but you know that the pupils can match those high expectations. And that warm welcome really does count for a lot. It also gives you an opportunity to address any issues if there are. Perhaps someone hasn't done a piece of homework, or has struggled with a piece of work, or you need to have a quick chat with somebody, which you could ask pupils are coming in just to speak to you at the end if there was that that situation from a previous lesson. But I would argue that the bulk of the time we really need to be wiping the slate completely clean and starting a brand new lesson off with a brand new sense of purpose and a brand new mindset. My own view, and I appreciate that there's different schools of thought around this, is that you have a starter activity. The fanciful terminology in the current climate is a do now activity. In old money, it's a lesson starter. But to my mind, having something that's on the table, on the board, there ready for the pupils to do as you're welcoming them to your classroom, means that as they come in, as they filter in and they sit down, they're instantly getting on with work. They're instantly doing something that's either going to reinforce previous learning, or it's going to introduce new learning to them. Now, what I don't want you to mistake this for is some kind of retrieval practice kind of tick box to say, oh, well, we did retrieval practice, done. Retrieval practice is far more complicated and intricate than that. And far more layered in terms of how that should feature within our lesson delivery. You could argue, of course, that if you start with a quiz at the start of a lesson, that is a form of retrieval practice. But we're not doing this to say that we've done retrieval practice. We're doing this to settle pupils into the mechanics of the lesson itself, and also to set the tone and the tenor of the lessons that you are here to work. And having that initial starter activity, if it's part of just what you do, it's just a norm, it's a routine, it's habitual. Then as the last pupils come in and they've sat down and they're getting on with the work, that's the point to take the register. And I've seen different ways of how people take registers. I think we should just keep this really simple. We want the pupils ideally working in silence on something for a few minutes, and you to call the register out with a strong, purposeful voice so the children can hear you. And the response from the pupils needs to be clear and purposeful. Yes, sir, present. Yes, miss, present. It doesn't need to be any more complex than that. And it's also important to remember that not taking the register in that kind of first 10 minutes, especially in a secondary setting, and that's not to negate what primary colleagues have to deal with, but that I'm just thinking here of the chopping and changing from lesson to lesson to lesson of different groups of pupils. If you haven't taken it, it represents a safeguarding issue in our schools. And then you need to introduce, once you've taken that register and you've gone through what that starter activity is, and it may well be that you're going through answers to a quiz. It might be that you've asked pupils to consider an image, a picture, a source, a piece of text that you then want to engage in a question and answering session to elicit and pull out what they've understood from it, and to correct any misconceptions, and to check ultimately for understanding. But then once you've done that part, it's really to introduce what the context of today's lesson is. And I would argue personally that you should hinge your lessons around a big question. I appreciate some schools like learning objectives, and I've seen probably every variant of learning objective under the sun. My concern with learning objectives is we spend so much time as teachers. I certainly did, in terms of, maybe it's my own misgivings as a teacher, formulating lesson objectives that ultimately didn't really mean anything, but had to be written down and had to be highlighted in red, amber or green by the pupils, both at the start and the end of the lesson, as some kind of warped form of assessment for learning. A big question is no more complicated than a question with which the disciplinary knowledge that you're going to be looking at today kind of formulates and hinges itself around. So to give you an example, and I'm a history teacher by trade, today we're going to look at the importance of the Wall Street crash in Hitler's rise to power. That's kind of the theme. So the big question could be, what was the significance of the Wall Street crash in Hitler's rise to power? And you're going to work towards answering that question either in today's lesson or maybe over a sequence of 3 or 4 lessons, because it may well be that what we're looking at is actually going to take multiple lessons. Now, this is just one way, no doubt of many ways in which lessons can begin, but this gives, I would argue, lessons a real sense of clarity, of order, of purpose. And importantly, it gives the pupils themselves certainty and consistency in terms of what the diet that they're going to receive. They're going to know coming into your room, this is how it's done in Mr. Strickland's lesson. So that's our strong starts. In terms of our exit routine, so now thinking about strong exits, I think very little is actually given in terms of consideration at times, not always, of course, to how lessons end. And I see many lessons where teachers have got the pupils engaged and they're writing and writing and writing until the last kind of 10, 15 seconds of a lesson. And I understand why that happens, because we've got so much content we want to go through and fire through that we think that getting pupils to continue to write is the answer. But the last 5 to 7 minutes of any given lesson is totally key to how a lesson should really come to an end. If we're working to the very end of the lesson, to the bell, so to speak, with our pupils, where's the time to collecting resources, collecting materials, to ensure the room is tidy, to ensure that pupil uniform is checked, to check for understanding, to dismiss the pupils in an orderly manner? You're likely to find that a lesson then closes its lid really quickly in its speed, and that all 30 pupils just go flying out the room really fast. Now, if we're in a school now where we're moving from lesson to lesson to lesson, as in the pupils are moving from lesson to lesson to lesson, we're firing out a class of pupils, multiple classes of pupils, if this is happening across a school, into a corridor, or the corridor, sorry, in almost a very chaotic manner, in a ruffled manner, and in a high-speed manner. And then we're expecting those pupils institutionally as a school to move on to the next lesson in an orderly, sensible manner and start lessons with purpose. But how can that happen if we're in the corridors flustered from the previous lesson? So part of the thinking here, and part of perhaps the mindset, but this is where there's a collective responsibility, is that lesson ends are a bit like the changing of a baton at a relay race. It's got to be a neat, clean, tidy, change of the baton that's not dropped to allow a neat, clean start elsewhere within the context of the school, or in my analogy sense, the context of the race. But those last 7 minutes are key. We really should be thinking, and trial this if you've never done this. What would happen if you brought your lesson in the normal sense to a close with 5 to 7 minutes of the lesson to go? That you've got an orderly, routinized approach to how resources are collecting. So, for example, all books are passed down to the end of each row or put in the middle of each pod within your class, and either you or a key pupil collects them all in. So it's done swiftly and precisely. Then you ask pupils to check the floor and pick up any litter, and a bin is passed around, or you walk around with the bin. As you're walking around with the bin, you could be surveying the pupils for their uniform. But as you're doing that, and I appreciate this is quite difficult because you're trying to do multiple things at once here as the teacher, you could be checking for understanding. So I don't think you need to spend hundreds of thousands of hours thinking this through. But if we go back to the notion of big questions, and the big question that we're hinging our lesson around today, think carefully now about the disciplinary knowledge that you were trying to instill in your pupils and trying to get them to not just learn, but understand and memorize from that lesson. It may be that you want to have maybe 3 or 4 key questions just drafted, ready for the end of the lesson, that you can fire around the room to check for understanding. But also the key here is that you're not just eliciting and taking answers from 1 or 2 or 3 pupils. You're taking them from the entirety of the room. You want everybody in that room to be talking, as in to be giving you an answer. And if there's a key, really key piece of knowledge that you want the pupils to know, you could get them to chorally chant it at the end. Then it allows you to elicit and understand for yourself as the teacher, what did the pupils actually understand in this lesson? What they gained from this lesson? If I was trying to instill in them, and I'm making this up, but I'm not, the equation for photosynthesis, and no one can recite it, no one can give it back to me, then clearly something hasn't landed. And that can help inform my teaching for next lesson, which allows us for a more kind of time efficient approach to informing our planning, both in terms of not having to spend hundreds of hours marking books, but also if we think about the frequency with which we might mark books in schools, it's certainly not at the end of every single lesson, in terms of most marking policies, and that's a different topic in its own right. But pulling out that level of checking for understanding at the end of the lesson is a very quick way of helping to influence perhaps some of your thinking and planning around your next lesson. Then you can allow the pupils to leave in a really kind of orderly manner by dismissing one row or one column or one pod at a time. So they're going into the corridors in an orderly manner and hopefully going in a calm, orderly manner to their next lesson. So hopefully it's given you a little bit of food for thought. I hope in watching that, my actual hope is that there's nothing new there to you and that you kind of know all of that stuff. But hopefully it's reassuring if nothing else. And again, if you like some of the ideas that I've discussed today, you might like my book, The Behaviour Manual. But thank you ever so much for listening.